lived side by side cooperatively for centuries, and indeed people of other faiths. Many Indians are therefore proud that more Muslims have remained in India than live in Pakistan, or at least until very recently, if one can extrapolate from the two countries' populations, who may well have overtaken our Muslim population, but fairly recently. Nonetheless, partition is history, quite literally. It's our geography that we can't get away from. Pakistan's relations with India began with communal rioting and warfare in 1947 over Kashmir, and have been bedeviled ever since by the festering dispute over that divided territory. Kashmir we think of as India's only Muslim majority state. Decades of open conflict and simmering hostility, punctuated by spasms of bonhomie that always seem to sputter out into recrimination, have characterized a relationship that has circumscribed India's options and affected its strategic choices, as it has Pakistan's. The knowledge that our nearest neighbor, populated as it is by people of a broadly similar ethnic mix and cultural heritage, defines itself in opposition to India and exercises its diplomatic and military energies principally to thwart and undermine us, has inevitably colored India's perceptions, actions, and calculations on the regional and global stage. The resort by Pakistan to the sponsorship, or by some elements in Pakistan, I don't want to quibble on that, to the sponsorship of militancy and terrorism within India as an instrument of policy since the 1980s, has made relations far worse than in the early years after independence. We in India cannot forget that we have learned to endure the unspeakable horrors of terrorist violence only since some maligned men in Pakistan concluded that it was cheaper and more effective to bleed India to death than to attempt to defeat it in conventional war. There have, after all, been 4 of those. And the fact is that attack after attack on Indian soil, Kargil comes to mind, Indian interests as well, on and off Indian soil, have been proven time and again to be financed, equipped, guided from across this border by terrorist groups who, in many cases, were known to have been patronized, protected, and trained by elements of your military establishment, including 2 suicide bombings of the Indian embassy in Kabul, the first of which was publicly, so I'm not revealing any Indian intelligence assessment, was publicly traced by American intelligence to the ISI. I'm citing the New York Times, not any confidential document. This is obviously all seen in New Delhi as part of an endeavor to bleed India and to inflict upon it what we understand the Pakistani strategist once called death by 1,000 cuts. India's response has been defensive, not belligerent. India is bluntly a status quo power that seeks nothing more than to be allowed to grow and develop in peace, free from these attentions of the elements from across the border who have visited such actions upon us. Now, we know that many in Pakistan, if we take them at their word, seem to perceive that there is some sort of Indian threat that justifies this militarism. It's a notion that has assiduously been peddled in global capitals, in some cases by highly paid lobbyists. Now, as an Indian parliamentarian and as somebody who has served, however briefly, in government, I have to say this is preposterous. Bluntly, there is not and cannot be an Indian threat to Pakistan, simply because there is absolutely nothing that Pakistan wants, including territory of any sort, that India wishes, that Pakistan possesses, that India wishes to take from it. 1971 is often mentioned, but it was a special case, a very special case, that no one in India believes can be replicated. A territory separated by more than 1,000 kilometers, a territory, as you know, with its own distinctive features, and one where the Pakistani crackdown resulted in the largest refugee movement known in human history of 10 million people crossing our borders. All of that created the events of 1971. Not only is this not replicable, but there is no thinking in India of anything analogous in today's Pakistan, or from today's Pakistani territory. Indeed, a proof had to be adduced for this. The best example would probably be India's decision in Tashkent in 1966 to give back, quote-unquote, to Pakistan every square inch of territory captured by our soldiers in what we call Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, including the strategic Haji Fir Pass, all of which is land that we, on our maps, claim to be our own. and we do not even insist on retaining what we see as our own territory, held by Pakistan since 1948, but captured fair and square in battle, why on earth would we try and seize anything else from Pakistan? Frankly, it strikes many of us in India that the Indian threat is merely a useful device, cynically exploited by the Pakistani military to justify their power and their grossly disproportionate share of your country's national assets. The central problem, in our view, affecting us as two neighbours, is not territory, not therefore Kashmir, but rather the nature of the Pakistani state itself, and specifically the stranglehold over the decision-making apparatus of this country, of the world's most lavishly funded military in terms of percentage of national resources and GDP consumed by any army on the planet. To paraphrase Voltaire on Prussia, it can be said that in India the state has an army, and in Pakistan the army has a state. The military, you know far better than I as a foreigner do, so I will not belabor the point. But it is striking that no elected civilian government has been allowed to complete its full term, with the exception, arguably, of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's that he was overthrown by the end of that first term. And the perception very much is that the army lays down the red lines that no civilian leader has dared to cross. And in return, it enjoys privileges unthinkable in India. I don't need to cite the research and all of this that we and other people elsewhere have read about the various ventures and areas in which the military establishment has done them. But this explains in our eyes why the myth of an Indian threat must be preserved, and it makes us worry and wonder whether there are military elements that will indefinitely constitute an obstacle to the establishment of normal relations once the civilian establishment convinces itself that we are a non-threatening neighbour. And it's worth recalling in this context that rarely had the Pakistani civilian government been more inclined to pursue peace with India than President Zardari's in 2008. President Zardari had been pushing for greatly expanded trade and commercial links with India and the liberalization of the restrictive visa regime between the two countries. Indeed, his foreign minister, my good friend Shah Mahmood Qureshi, was in Delhi for talks on these very issues on the day the terrorist assault occurred. We had also been following with interest public pronouncements from the civilian government of winding down the government's official support for Kashmiri militancy against India, disbanding, as was announced, of the ISI's political wing. And when President Zardari went so far as to propose a no-first-strike nuclear policy, matching India's stance but violating your own military stated nuclear doctrine, Indians briefly began to believe that at long last they'd found a Pakistani ruler who understood that normalizing relations with India would be of great practical benefit to Pakistan itself. Obviously it didn't last, because the president went farther than the military was prepared to allow him to. And there have certainly been frequent reminders to us in India that the civilian governments we talk to, which show every sign of wanting to move away from this old narrative of hatred and hostility, don't always call the shots. To take just one small example, since I mentioned 26/11, when in the wake of the Mumbai bombings, President Zardari and Prime Minister Gilani had acceded to the request of India's Prime Minister Manmohan Singh to send the head of the ISI to India to assist Indian authorities in their investigation. And indeed, the Pakistani authorities issued a press release saying they were doing so. The Pakistani military forced the civilian government into a humiliating climb down, saying that a lower level official might be sent instead. He wasn't. So in resuming peace talks, and now I speak very much, I stress, as somebody outside the government, Indians remain understandably wary of pursuing peace with dialogue partners whom many in New Delhi may see as at best ineffective and at worst duplicitous about the real threats emanating from Pakistani territory and some Pakistani institutions. We talk to a civilian government that neither launches the assaults on us nor has the power to stop them. The real institution we need to make peace with may well be an institution we don't talk to, either in track-II dialogues or when we sit across each other at the diplomatic table. Now, we are conscious that the forces that I have tried to mention and outline have themselves begun to constitute a threat to Pakistan's own democracy and Pakistan's own civil society. My wife and I have just checked in half an hour ago to the Marriott Hotel, and we all know what happened there, targeting your own people. Certainly, a president who's a widower of somebody who was martyred to a terrorist attack understands that India's enemies in Pakistan are also his own. The very forces of Islamist extremism behind the Marriott bombings, behind his wife's killing, all argue for a strong case for united action by both governments to cauterize the cancer in their midst. There is clearly a rational argument that things have gone too far in the wrong direction, that cooperation is the only way forward. But the problem is that each terrorist attack undermines the case for such an approach and discredits the minority on both sides who believe that cooperation is necessary. Yes, you can say that by allowing terrorism to derail our efforts at peace, we are giving a veto, we're holding our peace process hostage to the bad guys, instead of building our peace process on the faith we should have in each other. But politically, as you all realize, that is much easier said than done. Our government is genuinely committed to peaceful relations with Pakistan. I can say this after many, many conversations with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, going back to before my own entry into Indian politics. I can vouch for the genuineness of his beliefs and commitments. The vision we have in India of a subcontinent living in peace and prosperity, focusing on development, not in any way distracted by hostility and violence, is a genuine vision at the highest levels of our system. But we do need to see, for our own domestic politics, we do need to see evidence of good faith and action from Islamabad before we can, in the words of our Prime Minister, spoken in Parliament, and you know that that's a sacred commitment in the parliamentary system, before India can meet Pakistan more than halfway, the first steps must come from Pakistan, by which New Delhi insists that Islamabad crack down completely on the militant groups that have targeted India, the training camps be dismantled, that bank accounts be frozen, not as General Musharraf once did, with enough notice for them to be emptied and transferred to other accounts operated by the same people, and that the leaders, particularly the visible and audible ones, be arrested and prosecuted firmly and sincerely. Our hope in India is that neither you nor us will be obliged to live with the state of affairs in Pakistan, where some elements incubate terror, while the country's institutions remain either unable or unwilling or both to push back against the so-called non-state actors that are said to be out of your government's control. Obviously, with Pakistani institutions having themselves become victims, the old military headquarters, the naval base, we hope that this has certainly stiffened official resolve to confront these non-state actors. We certainly hope that no one in Pakistan will be seduced by the dangerous idea that terrorists who attack the Pakistani military are bad, but those who attack India are tacitly to be encouraged. As your military takes on the extremely difficult task of fighting some of these terrorist groups, Indians, for the most part, so the vast majority, feel a tremendous degree of solidarity with the Pakistani people. It is striking that no one in any official position in India has in any way given vent to what the Germans call Schadenfreude, the state and satisfaction and misfortunes of others, or implied that the violence assailing Pakistan is a case of Pakistani chickens coming home to roost. That sort of sentiment has never been expressed at any serious level in my country. But there is, at bottom, a concern that what Pakistan is suffering from today is a result, in part, of a deliberate policy of inciting, financing, training, equipping militants and jihadis for over 20 years as an instrument of state policy. As Dr. Frankenstein discovered when he built his monster, it is impossible to control the monster once it is built. Democrats in India believe that the Pakistani people deserve better. And this is why the two countries would make common cause against the same, the forces of violent militancy and extremism. Certainly you've heard from Aziz Bhai about the spirit of Thimphu, and we heard earlier about cricket diplomacy. I think I've met a few people in Pakistan who were at Mohali, as my wife and I were. designer diplomacy, some been talking about, very elegant foreign minister coming to Delhi also in 2011. All of this is taking the process forward, and the resultant thaw has produced the only one, substantive policy decision so far, and that is Islamabad's decision to announce that it will reciprocate the most favoured nation trading status that India granted it 16 years ago unilaterally. Now, I do want to stress, of course, that as far as we understand it, there's still a lot to be done before that MFN status is operationalized from the Pakistani side. But it has rankled a bit in India that for 16 years, the only example in global trading history of a country that has offered a unilateral MFN agreement and not had it reciprocated. So we very much welcome this change of heart here. There is no doubt that a climate of peace can only be built on a foundation of trust, unimpeded by the use of the threat to, by the use or the threat to use terror as a means to achieve narrow ends. I think British Prime Minister David Cameron recently reminded Pakistan on your own soil that it could not win the respect of the world so long as it condoned the export of terror to India. To acknowledge that that trust does not exist right now is not to suggest that trust can never be built. I believe it can be. The differences that bedevil our relations with Pakistan can be surmounted if we can arrive at mutually acceptable parameters that can define our relationship in the future. I've talked about Pakistani cooperation on terrorism, and I know that this rankles sometimes with friends like Ijaz Haider. I call him a friend even though we're meeting for the first time today. We've read each other. And he and some other writers appear to think that, or have even alleged, that New Delhi seeks some sort of Indian supremacy in the subcontinent, and the resolution of the dispute only on India's terms. As an Indian, let me state unequivocally that my country is totally reconciled to Pakistan's existence as an independent state. There is no desire to reintegrate it, as some fear still, into some sort of pre-partition Akhand Bharat. Indeed, the demographic, social and political evolution of Pakistan since 1947 make it quite unthinkable. I do understand that Pakistan has to survive in a tough neighborhood and it needs a capable military. I don't think anybody in India denies that Pakistan needs a capable military. And I do not expect any Pakistani government, military or civilian, to act in anything but Pakistan's own best interest. But, and alas, there is a but, I don't believe it is in Pakistan's best interest to be the country whose military consumes the largest percentage of natural resources, both GDP and annual budget of any military in the world. I don't believe it's in Pakistan's best interest to adopt a policy of seeking strategic depth, quote unquote, by destabilizing its neighbors. I don't believe it's in Pakistan's best interest to try to wrest Kashmir from India by fair means or foul. I don't believe it's in Pakistan's best interest to even any extent be the cradle and crucible of militant Islamist terrorism. I don't believe it's in Pakistan's best interest to be a country where no elected civilian government has ever served for a term. But these are observations that come from an Indian, and I expect you to discount them immediately. But I do want to stress that Pakistanis who agree with even part of my views will certainly find willing partners for peace in India. Terrorism is a tragic blight of our times, but its appeal could diminish if economic opportunities for youth are increased and greater political pluralism is offered. Frankly, and let me speak very bluntly as if I was speaking to an Indian audience, a failing Pakistan with a burgeoning population of uneducated, unemployed, and frustrated youth creates an blandishment of radical religious fanatics. Such a Pakistan would be a major threat not only to Pakistani society but to India itself. This gives India a vested interest in the success, the stability, and the prosperity of Pakistan. And I do hope that Pakistanis will accept that coming from an Indian. Of course, India has long been in favor of placing the Kashmir dispute on the back burner and promoting trade, travel, and the rest. It is Pakistan that has long taken the view that there cannot be normal relations with India until Kashmir is settled on terms acceptable to Islamabad. So inasmuch as there is hostility or non-cooperation, this has started with Pakistan, which wants a change in the status quo, and not with India, which actually is perfectly content to leave things the way they are territorially. We understand that Pakistani and Indian objectives in Kashmir are not at present reconcilable. That the Pakistanis accept a policy of across-the-board engagement with India, despite the lack of a solution immediately to the Kashmir dispute. If we can make progress on specific issues like trade, agriculture, educational exchanges, cultural exchanges, the climate for an eventual Kashmiri settlement would itself change for the better. It has long rankled in Delhi, for example, that the debate over MFN has completely failed to take into account India's unilateral generosity, the only example, as I said, of that. And I believe it hasn't been mentioned much in the debate in this country since the Pakistanis think many of the critics of the government's announcement seem to act as if Pakistan is doing the unilateral favor, not that Pakistan is 16 years late in responding. But we should not even be worrying about the minutiae of an MFN. We should be talking seriously within the